this highly law and order organization, and they would tend to take the law into their own hands.
This organization became very violent very quickly. It was especially violent in Texas. As soon as they had the first march in Houston, almost right away, they started grabbing people off the street and flogging them horribly for real or imagined misdemeanors.
And Georgetown had no problem at all in getting to be a chapter. Had meetings here, had big cross lightings. When they lighted a cross, they lighted it because it was symbolic that God illuminates our path.
It did attract people who maybe felt slighted or unappreciated. It offered them a mystical organization with all this pomp and pageantry, all this ceremony. And it made an ordinary individual feel all powerful.
Americans just don't generally know that they attacked at least as many white people as black people.
Between 1921 and 1923, more than 500 acts of Klan violence were reported in Texas. And due to its connections and power, few were prosecuted, and none resulted in jail time for any of the perpetrators.
They did some wicked, evil stuff and got away with it.
Earnest prosecutors really tried to indict and prosecute and convict these characters, but they couldn't actually punish these guys, and so the violence went on because there was nothing to fear.
And all they had to do was bring in one Klansman after another lying through his teeth about those defendants, and the preponderance of evidence based on 50 people testifying, lying, meant that there was no conviction.
This included the Austin case of Peeler Clayton, who on a dark night in 1921 turned down the wrong alley and was gunned down by members of the Austin Klan. The story was front-page news for weeks. While it was clear to authorities the KKK had committed the crime, there was no eyewitness testimony, and the Klan's connections polluted the system so much that Travis County District Attorney Ben Robertson resigned from his position, leaving his relative, a 27-year-old Dan Moody, to fill his shoes, and putting Dan right in the middle of the fight.
Dan Moody was very anti-Klan. He said the Ku Klux Klan thought of themselves as law and order.
And young Dan started looking for a chance to prosecute a case against the Klan. He found that opportunity in 1923 with a case that actually involved something that happened here in Taylor, his hometown.
Winter of 1922 in the small town of Weir, Texas. Ralph Burleson, a World War I veteran and traveling salesman of women's hosiery, rented a room in this house from local widow Fanny Campbell. The extra income helped provide for her 5 children, but the Georgetown chapter of the Klan saw it differently.
They were rumored to be having some sort of illicit affair.
And the Klan got word that he was staying up there with this widow woman. And so they thought, there might be some hanky-panky going on.
Local Klansman and Baptist preacher, Reverend A.A. Davis, delivered a note to this house, embossed with the Klan symbol and containing the threat that the Klan did not approve of his relationship, and Burleson needed to immediately leave town or face the consequences. Enraged by the accusations, Burleson chased off Davis's car, and Fanny Campbell burned the note. It was the first encounter between Burleson and the Klan, but it wouldn't be the last.
I think that's what got them really mad, that he had challenged their power and their authority.
The following spring, on Easter Sunday, Ralph Burleson, Fanny Campbell, along with her former sister and brother-in-law, Carrie and Lee Jones, took an afternoon drive. They left Weir, arriving at Mankins Crossing, and then headed east to visit a friend in the town of Jonah. After a short conversation, the group headed back toward Georgetown, down Old Highway 29, where the KKK was expecting them. On this section of highway, Burleson approached 2 cars, traveling slower than expected. He passed the first one, and as he came up to the second, it stopped. The other sped up and blocked him in on the side. Burleson was trapped.
And they grabbed Burleson, and they literally jerked him out to the driver's side door, and they started pistol whipping him. Boom! Beat him over the head with this big pistol.
They put a bag over Burleson's head and threw him in the back of their truck. driving him just north of Taylor, Texas, to an area now developed as Murphy Park. They took Burleson to a tree along the fence line, twisted with metal wire, much like this one.
They tied him to a tree over there, and they put a big long work chain around his neck. And then they used a big leather strap to horsewhip the guy. They tore his clothes off, and they horsewhipped him. They beat the flesh off of his back from his shoulders to his knees.
Each one would lay on about 15 or 20 stripes. And they kept trying to make him say that, yes, he was having sex with Fanny Campbell. And he said no, as long as he could take it. And finally, he was suffering so much, he said yes, and then they stopped.
The beating finished, but the punishment wasn't done. They took Burleson to the lawn of Taylor City Hall, where they again chained him to a tree.
He was laying on this tree, and they poured hot tar and grease over all those open wounds. And they left him on that tree to die as an object lesson. When the Klan speaks, you better listen, boy.
But Burleson didn't die. He was able to untie himself from the tree and pulled himself to a nearby boarding house, where he was found by Taylor Constable Lewis Lowe and brought to the Taylor Fire Department. Lowe described Burleson's condition in graphic detail.
His head was pretty badly beaten up, but I couldn't tell so very much about it because this stuff was all over him and he couldn't say much. His eyes, mouth, ears, and hair were full of this stuff. There were several places, some half dozen or dozen places, where the skin was bursted and the opening was entirely raw as a beefsteak.
Burleson was then taken to the Taylor Sanitarium to recover. With his beating, the Klan had intended to send a message, one received all too well by District Attorney Dan Moody. 4 days later, at the direction of Moody, 5 Taylor men were arrested, including a city marshal, a butcher, a barber, a farmer, and the unemployed Murray Jackson.
The Klan had never been brought to trial, convicted, and sentenced for these wicked, evil deeds that they've been doing. Never. So Dan Moody said, be that as it may, he said, we're going to do exactly that.
But he wanted to go after the Klan, and his main purpose really was to end their reign in Texas. He was trying to show members of the Klan, if you do this, you may be punished.
Moody was now faced with how to proceed. As his trial strategy, he went after who he perceived to be the easiest target, the unemployed Murray Jackson, which is when everyone's attention